Okay, welcome everybody. Good afternoon, good evening, depending on your time zone. It is a pleasure to be learning with you all as part of the Spring Zman here at Drisha. This is the first session of From Revelation to Realization, Matan Torah and Shavuot with Miss Sarah Gordon. Um, as you come into the Zoom, I will invite you to become a panelist. Don't worry, we're not expecting you to speak on any kind of panel. It just means that you will be invited into the main Zoom room so that you can turn on your camera if you wish, and you'll be able to unmute yourself to ask questions or to give comments when Miss Gordon invites them. You are encouraged to accept that invitation to become a panelist. We just ask that when you're not speaking, you keep yourself on mute. It minimizes the background noise so that we can all hear each other. Your questions and comments are always welcome in the Zoom chat or in the Facebook comments if you're joining us on Facebook Live. And before we start, I will give a little introduction. So, Shavuot is a captivating holiday with dual significance. On one hand, it holds a legal aspect, emphasizing the giving of the Torah through the reading of the Ten Commandments. On the other hand, it embraces a human dimension through the Book of Ruth, a narrative centered on the harvest and the acts of kindness within the community. This course will emphasize the complementary nature of both aspects. First, we will examine various models of revelation and different aspects of the Ten Commandments. Then we will shift our focus to realization, delving into the practical challenges when living a Torah-guided life in society, as seen in the Book of Ruth. Through these texts, the course will address questions such as, what does it look like practically for a society to live in accordance with Torah law? What needs to shift and what accommodations need to be made? What messages do we get from both the law and the narrative sections of the Torah? And we will be learning with Sarah Gordon, who is the Senior Director of Israel Education, AMER, for Unpacked for Educators, a division of Open Door Media. Previously, Sarah served as the Director of Israel Guidance and Experiential Education at Mayonot High School, where she taught Talmud, chaired a course on contemporary Israel, and brought her vision and creativity to a wide range of school programs. Sarah holds a dual master's degree in Jewish education and modern Jewish history from Yeshiva University, where she spent 2 years studying in the GPATS program, and where she's currently pursuing her doctorate of education as a Wexner Fellow. Sarah lives in Teaneck, New Jersey, with her husband, Nafi Schwartzberger, and their 2 children. And with that, I will pass it over to Ms. Gordon.
Okay, thank you so much. I'm just gonna share my screen so that we're all set up over here. Here we go. And I think we'll be sharing the source sheet in the chat as well, even though, here we go. And I guess just give me a thumbs up if you can see the screen. Everything is, okay, amazing. Okay, so hi everyone. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. Firstly, I want to thank the Drisha Institute. Always a pleasure to be teaching and learning from Drisha. I want to thank Rabbi John Kelson, Kayla Bloom, and Linaz Evans for holding down the fort on the technical side. And I really just want to encourage everyone to really check out the other Drisha courses being offered this Zman this semester, as they really look excellent, and I'm hoping to catch some of the recordings myself. Okay, so as Luna's already kind of introduced the series, I'll just kind of echo or piggyback off of that. And really in this series, the goal is to really talk about this dual aspect of Shavuot and how it can encompass both the revelation and realization, the giving of the Torah to seeing it in practice. And I think we really see these two aspects in Shavuot in both of the texts that we read over the holiday. And something that's always kind of intrigued me, that on one hand, we have the giving of the Torah, Matan Torah, the 10 Commandments, which represents the legal aspect, the laws, halacha, revelation at Sinai, seen through, right, the Aseret HaDibrot, the 10 Commandments. But then there's also the lived aspect. Now that we've received the Torah, what does this look like in practice in society in lived experience. And I think that's something that's really seen in the other main text that we read over Shavuot through Megillat Ruth, which is the story of what happens to the family of Naomi, Ruth, also Boaz and Beit Lechem, and what is the relationship between the laws we receive and how the society in Megillat Ruth really tries to bring this to actuality. So in the first two shiurim, we're going to focus on the 10 Commandments on the Aseret HaDibrot, and the last two will focus on Megillat Ruth, but these themes will kind of weave through all four shiurim. And today, or tonight, really, our goal is to focus specifically on Matan Torah, on the revelation at Sinai, and what the different models for this revelation are. So with that, as we jump in to tonight's shiur, I'd love to start with kind of asking you, and you can post in the chat, when you think of Har Sinai, when you think of Matan Torah and the experience of receiving the Torah on Har Sinai, what comes to mind? This could be a word, this could be an image, but I'm curious what comes to mind when you think of Matan Torah, and you can feel free to post on the chat if you want. We'll give everyone a minute to kind of think that through. All right, I'm hearing fire, thunder, and lightning, right? The kind of intensity of that experience. If anyone else wants to add as well. If anyone's brave and wants to kind of unmute themselves and jump in, that's fine as well. We'll give everyone another minute, and you can keep kind of posting in the chat. I'm really curious kind of what image comes to mind when you think first of this revelation at Sinai, what pops into your head. So please feel free to continue to post in the chat. But it's interesting that in rabbinic thought, in thought of Chazal, there are actually a few different ways that they frame the revelation at Sinai. And I want to look at three approaches, two really from rabbinic thought and one from kind of a modern kind of scholarly approach as well. The first model is one of coercion. Maybe not the most, positive one to start off on, but we may be familiar with the rabbinic text, and we're going to do a deep dive into it tonight that talks about how God flipped the mountain over the Jewish people's head and basically kind of told them, if you don't, either you accept the Torah or otherwise we're dropping the mountain, kind of this model of coercion. The second one visualizes, and we'll see this through different midrashim, the giving of the Torah through the model of a marriage. And the third one, which is kind of the more scholarly one, is going to see Matan Torah as a treaty between two unequal parties that kind of come together to form a certain treaty. So kind of coercion, marriage, and treaty. And our goal really is to spend some time going through these three kind of models, or three kind of, ways of framing Matan Torah. And through this, to consider what aspects of the giving of the Torah, of the revelation, of the 10 Commandments are kind of highlighted by each of these aspects. Which one of these, or which aspects of each, resonate perhaps most personally for us, or that we find most meaningful as we reflect on our own kind of experience with, receiving the Torah, or, engaging, in a life of, Jewish practice or halachic practice. And finally, hopefully to gain some takeaways of what each of these models could mean for us in our experience as Jews today. So with that, let's really jump in to that first model of coercion. So as we said before, there's this very famous rabbinic teaching that sees the giving of the Torah, that the Jewish people were forced into the receiving the Torah. So where does this come from? So let's look at the text. So source number one here in Sefer Shemot, and I'll read the Hebrew, but you can follow along in both the Hebrew and in the English, sets really the scene of the Jewish people, approaching Har Sinai, and the Torah is about to be given. And as people posted in the chat, right, the thunder and the lightning and everything's happening. And Pasuk 17, what happens? Moshe leads the people out of the camp towards God, and they take their place at the foot of the mountain. So Rashi in source number 2 explains what's the simplest, or the pshat explanation of this text. Lefi pshuto b'raglei har. That what does it mean that they stood at the bottom of the mountain? That they literally just kind of gathered and stood at the bottom of the mountain. But he goes on and he gives kind of a midrashic interpretation, which we see will be the rabbinic text in a second. Umidrasho, this is again source 2. Shenitzlash hahar mimkomo v'nikfeh alehem kigigit. And the Midrashic interpretation, what does it mean they stood at the bottom or the foot of the mountain? Not that they gathered at the bottom of the mountain, but that literally the mountain was yanked out of place, flipped and turned over them. Here the analogy is like a beer barrel, right? So kind of like they were literally just staring up at the foot at the bottom of the mountain. It was dangling over them, about to be dropped. So the kind of expanded version of this midrash, of this narrative, is brought down in source number 3 in the Talmud Bavli, Masachet Shabbat, Daf Pechet Amud Aleph. And I'll read through this, and after this, I'm curious to stop and reflect and to hear what people's thoughts are as we go through this. So here's the third source. So it starts off, Amar Rav Avdimi Bar Chama Bar Chasa. And feel free to follow along again in the Hebrew and the English. Here, this translation is from Sefaria. So Rav Avdimi Bar Chama Bar Chasa said, Melamed, and this is again focusing on those words that they stood at the bottom of the mountain, Vayitzvu B'Tachtit Har. Melamed Shekafa HaKadosh Baruch Hu Alehem Et Har Kigigit. Right, that the Holy One, like God, overturned the mountain over the Jewish people like a tub. Right before we had beer barrel, now tub, but some kind of big object is flipped over them. But Amar Lahem, Imatem Mekablim HaTorah Mutav. If you now accept the Torah, amazing. Ve'im Lav Sham Tehei Kvuratchem. And if you do not, then here will be your graves. Meaning the mountain will be dropped. Game over, and everyone will, that's it. You're almost like threatened here with being wiped out if you don't accept the Torah. Amar Rav Acha Bar Yaakov, and Rav Acha Bar Yaakov joins the discussion and says, Mikan Moda'a Rabba L'Oraita. And he says, here is, here the translation from Sefaria is from here, there's a substantial caveat to the obligation to fulfill the Torah. Maybe we'll translate this a little bit simpler here's a big challenge on receiving the Torah, meaning that if the Jewish people, if this Agadic, Midrashic kind of rabbinic source here is saying that the Jewish people were forced into receiving the Torah, then kind of, negates our obligation almost to keep it, because we were forced into it. This wasn't something we wanted to do. We didn't have free choice, right? We were threatened with destruction. So we probably just said yes, so we wouldn't be crushed by the mountain. So how do we kind of answer that? Amar Rava, and Rava answers, Afal Piken Hadur Kabluhu Bimei Chashveirosh Dechtiv Kimu Bekiblo Yehudim Kimu Ma Shekiblu Kfar. And this is kind of the answer that's given here, is that yes, perhaps Har Sinai is tainted according to this Midrashic, Agadic interpretation because we were forced into it. But later on in Jewish history, in the Purim story, we have a verse in Megillat Esther, Kimu Bekiblo Yehudim, the Jews get up and accept. And here it views that kind of homiletically, as saying that the Jews got up and accepted what they had previously took upon themselves, meaning that yes, we were forced into accepting the mitzvot at Har Sinai, but later on in the time period of Purim, the Jews accepted on themselves of their own free will, thus solving any problems. The Gemara goes on. The last part that I'll just kind of highlight because it'll become important later is a little bit more of kind of an agadata, of kind of learning out different things from different psukim, and it tells us Melamed, here's his on page 2, the underlined part, Shehetzneh Kadosh Baruch Hu im Masa Bereshit V'amar lahem im Yisrael mekablim haTorah atem mitkayimim ve'im lav ani machzir etchem letohu v'vohu. Interesting take here on kind of the stakes of the Jewish people accepting the Torah. That God basically said that if the Jewish people, accept the Torah, then creation will continue to exist. But if they rejected it, then the entire world would revert to chaos. That part we'll leave for now. That's going to come, relevant a little bit later. But here we really see this model of the Jewish people kind of almost seeing Matan Torah as this mountain dangling over their heads. It's this model of coercion. And what are we to do really with this text? And just some thoughts or just some questions to kind of throw out, right? What does it mean for Torah to be coerced? Why does acceptance of the Torah in this case have to be forced? How does this impact our experience as Jews keeping the Torah, right? To see this framing of it kind of forced upon the Jewish people. Does this text resonate or challenge us? And I'm curious, if people have thoughts. If anyone wants to share, feel free to post in the chat. I'm curious just how people where this text is kind of hitting you. This kind of image here of coercion. Just skip down over here for a second. People can feel free to jump in. Feel free to raise your hand. Lily Naz will let me know if anyone's raising their hand, if anyone wants to jump in, and feel free to post in the chat as well. And as I encourage you to keep thinking, about this model of coercion, I wanted to share a few ways that this text has been interpreted in different ways by Jewish thinkers. And I'll share a few of them. And I'm curious if this can help kind of deepen our understanding of this model, of seeing the giving of the Torah as this model almost of coercion. So one approach is taken by the Meshech Chachma. So it's Rav Simcha Cohen of Dvinsk in Latvia. Wrote kind of a magnum opus on Tanakh, a parish on Chumash as well. And he takes the following approach, and I see people are posting comments. Amazing. Keep posting comments, and I'll respond to those in a second. And he actually takes it in the following way, almost as not literally, but I mean, the whole thing, right, is a metaphor, but he takes it even more so as a metaphor. So what does he say over here? And I'll just read the underlined part in Hebrew. Perush shehera lahem kavod Hashem behikitz ubehit galut nifla'a ad ki mamash batla bechiratam hativi. And he says it basically, what does it mean that God dangled the mountain over their head and threatened them like with destruction? He takes it kind of in a totally different direction, says that it means that the Jewish people saw God's glory in such a clear way that they did not have any free choice at that matter. The natural, the most obvious thing to them seemed to be to accept the Torah, and to not accept the Torah when they had kind of come face to face with God's, glory and no doubts existed anymore. To reject the Torah at that moment would have felt tantamount to jumping off a cliff almost, to being destroyed. So not so much that God is threatening them, but really that they're kind of, taking a little bit out of context, seeing it here a little more as this metaphor, that it would have removed all free will, and that free will was taken away. And that's what it means kind of in that moment. Again, by the way, important to note, we still have that challenge in the Gemara, right? That this isn't ideal. We don't want, it's still a challenge. Well, okay, so then they lost all free will. So how are we supposed to see this as binding? But during the Purim story, they accepted on themselves. Fine. But this sees it really through the framing of the absence of free will. I actually want to focus on a little bit of a different direction, which is going to be the next source that we see of the Tosfot. But I just want to comment, I see people wrote, that the coercion, right? I see, right, Lina's wrote, right, the coercion can make us uncomfortable, right? So we want to say yeah, but later on we accept it on ourselves, right? To kind of cushion that almost, right? And I think an important point, right? I see Joyce has posted as well, and we're going to talk about that, right? Didn't they originally say Na'aseh v'nishma? Didn't they originally say it? They were going to take it upon themselves, and they chose it. So then why, right? The coercion is kind of canceling that out. And that's exactly what we're going to get to in a couple of sources. So stay tuned. So we saw the Meshech Chochmah takes it in the aspect of free will. But if we look at source 5, the Tosfot on this page of Gemara actually raises another kind of interesting point. And he says, what are we talking about over here? And he actually mentions Na'aseh v'nishma. Even though the Jewish people already said Na'aseh v'nishma, we're going to listen and we're going to do, and they already accepted it all, sight unseen. They didn't see the Torah. They didn't see the contract. They just accepted it. Shema yihiyu chozrin kashiyiru ha'esh hagdola. Perhaps they would retract Na'aseh v'nishma when they saw the great fire on the mountain. And that could be just the intensity of the experience and the scariness of it. Or some take this to mean perhaps when they actually got a list of here's all the 613 things you're going to have to do, people were whoa, that wasn't made clear before, right? There'll be kind of a backtracking. And Tosfot sees this coercion in this image of the mountain dangling over their heads as an insurance policy. Technically, the Jews already said Na'aseh v'nishma, right? But they accepted it before they saw the contract, like what I do on my iPhone when there's an update, right? You don't actually read it, you just kind of click accept. But when they see everything at Har Sinai, they might change their minds. So we want to lock in their prior commitment by force. That's Tosfot. Maharal, and this will be the last source we see kind of in this medley, and this is the one where I want to spend the most amount of time. And this is Rabbi Yehuda Lau ben Betzalel from Prague. So he kind of takes an alternate approach here to Tosfot. And this is where I want to spend most of our time. For Tosfot, it's a bug, right? We don't want, yes, it's not great. We don't want the Jewish people to back out. So how do we fix this bug, right, with the system? We're going to have coercion as an insurance policy. We don't want them to backtrack. For the Maharal, it's not really a bug, but it's a feature. This is something that you actually need coercion with Matan Torah. Why do you need coercion? So let's read through it together. So I'll read the Hebrew, and again, you can follow along in the English. Aval masha kafa alehem hahar, shelo yomru Yisrael, this is source number 6, anachnu kibalnu haTorah me'atzmeinu. Why do we need this flipping of the mountain? Because we don't want the Jewish people to say that they accepted the Torah because it was their choice. V'im lo hayinu rotzim, lo hayinu mekablim Torah. And if we didn't want it, we wouldn't have accepted it. That's not what we want people saying about the Torah. We don't want it to be that like, oh, the Jews just accepted it because they wanted to, and if they didn't want it, they would have walked away. Why? V'dvar zeh lo hayam ma'alat haTorah, because this would not have been worthy of the Torah. Ki haTorah kol ha'olam talui ba, because the entire world is dependent on the Torah. I'll skip a little bit. V'lefichach ein ra'ui shetiyeh kabbalat haTorah b'bechirat Yisrael. It's not appropriate for acceptance of the Torah to be dependent on the choice of the Jewish people. Rak shaya kadosh baruch hu mechayev umachriach otam lekabel haTorah. God had to force them to accept the Torah. Because without this, we could have, the whole world, this is kind of what we saw at the end of our Gemara, the whole world could have been reduced back to chaos if the Jewish people had not accepted it. And I think here really this is a fascinating take, I think, by the Maharal, right? He's saying over here that accepting the Torah or Matan Torah is so high stakes and it's of so high value that it would almost be derogatory or disrespectful to Torah for it to be dependent on human choice. The only appropriate or worthy kind of way for Torah to be given would have to be the Jewish people are forced into it. I think this is fascinating because it's such a foreign concept for us today. I think for many of us, and I can speak from my experience, teaching in the classroom. So I think especially for young people, for students today, but even for myself, I would say if you ask us, what draws you to Judaism? Why do you keep Torah? Why do you keep certain mitzvot? I don't want to assume, but I think for many of us, right, we would probably say, because I find it meaningful, right? It speaks to me. It connects my family. It's tradition. There's a big focus on doing things because we feel connected to them. And we spend a lot of time and community resources through shuls and synagogues and schools and community organizations trying to help and guide people to feel connected to Judaism in meaningful ways. I think it's rare if you surveyed a group of teenagers today and perhaps even adults that they would say, yeah, I am an observant Jew because, I'm commanded to do it. I think it would be very rare I don't want to assume, but I think it would be rare to hear that answer. And this idea of commandedness or obligation can sometimes be very foreign. And I think that's the switch that can be helpful for us to kind of, before we were saying coercion, but if we kind of switch that to kind of like feeling it as obligation or kind of like a heaviness that comes with that, but obligation nonetheless. And I think we see this reflected in other rabbinic texts as well. In source number 7, and this comes up in a few different places in the Gemara, we're told, I'll just read the underlined part here so people can see the English. Rav Chanina says, Gadol ha-mitzuveh ve'oseh misha eino mitzuveh ve'oseh. Right? In rabbinic thought, it's greater to be one who's commanded and does a mitzvah rather than be someone who's not commanded and takes it on. And I think that, whenever I would teach this in a high school setting, students really struggle with it. They would say, well, if I show up to volunteer when I'm not obligated to come, I should get more points. Like that's more valuable. Like, look at me, I'm stepping up, I'm showing up. And this idea kind of that there's value also in doing what you're commanded to do. When there's almost like sometimes a natural inclination to push away, right, or to rebel, there's value in showing up and fulfilling the obligations that are expected to you, right? But that's a little bit of a foreign kind of, right, cultural difference, right? As Luna said, like a culture clash here. And I remember many discussions with the former head of school when I worked at Maino with Mrs. Rivka Kahan, and she would often speak to students about this and to faculty that how can we navigate the tension between wanting students to feel connected with also cultivating a feeling of being a mitzvah, of being someone who's commanded, right? And it's a real kind of challenge. And I invite you kind of in the chat, if you have suggestions, thoughts on this, today, do we feel this sense, this weight of commandedness? Is this a value for us, right? I feel like, when we're trying to, teach people or approach Judaism, Yahadu, Torah in different ways, we kind of shy away from that aspect, the commandedness. It's not always so comfortable for us, right? But there is a real kind of weight here. And I think that's what we're kind of seeing here with this idea of the Maharal. What level is worthy of Torah? Like, again, the forcedness, is harsh, like seems harsh, but this idea of like being commanded, of being obligated, can also be somewhat foreign. And I want to share kind of two ways to kind of process this idea of obligation. One of them, we'll skip to source number 8, kind of a more recent rabbi, Rav Yaakov Kamenetsky, was a posek, a halachic decider, and a Rosh Hashiva in the United States. And he says the following: Shebe'emet tzrichim l'shnei inyanim. This is source number 8. Hainu ha'avodah me'ahava ve'avodah miyira. Ki lepamim lo tafsik lo ha'ava ve'lepamim techlash etzlo ha'yira. And he says the following. He says that really, when we consider this concept, it might be about balancing two aspects: balancing the yira, the awe or the fear, with the ava, with the love, right? Nasev and nishma, which people alluded to before, telling God that we will do and we will do and we will listen, is the choosing because we want it, right? It's focusing on our own agency and our meaning, and that's really important. That's the ahava aspect, the love aspect. But then you also want people to keep it when life gets hard. And for that, you really need the mitzvah, the commandedness aspect, which perhaps is what is reflected in this idea of flipping the mountain. So that's that first aspect. It's balancing yira and ava, the nasev and nishma aspect, with later on the kind of, sense of obligation, to kind of have those two poles and balancing those two poles. That's one aspect. The second aspect, and with this we'll kind of wrap up this first approach and move on to the other models, is that of kind of something that's seen in the thought of Rav Soloveitchik. And that is, I'll kind of riff off it a little bit, but this idea that maybe we need to bring back the sense of being a mitzvah, the sense of commandedness or obligation, and kind of bring this aspect back a little bit more in today's society. And Rav Soloveitchik talks a lot about this aspect of almost like as a positive value of being defeated by God. So what does this really mean, kind of being defeated by God? So in source number 9, there's a footnote actually in The Lonely Man of Faith, right? When he talks about this element of coercion, right, that we've been talking about in the Sinai covenant. Let's read the underlined part. Lies in the idea that covenantal man feels overpowered and defeated by God, even when he appears to be a free agent of his own will. Right, that there's almost this value in kind of recognizing our limits as human vis-a-vis the divine, right, where we're almost overpowered by God, right? And there's kind of value in that we want to move forward. But we also need to kind of sometimes retreat and recognize our limits. And Rav Soloveitchik develops this beautifully. And actually, this is one of my favorite articles that he's written, and I only pulled some excerpts, but I really encourage you, if you have time, to read the whole thing. An article called Catharsis, which was published in Tradition, years ago, but really excellent article. So I encourage everyone to check it out. And he says the following: the theme of this article of Catharsis, Rav Soloveitchik is trying to talk about what is gevura, what is true strength. So I'll just read some excerpts from that first paragraph. What is heroism in halacha? I'll skip a little bit. The answer is one must perform a dialectical movement. The halachic catharsis expresses itself in paradoxical movement in two opposite directions, in surging forward boldly and retreating humbly. It's a lot of, I feel like, Rav Soloveitchik words, right, in that sentence to unpack. But this idea of kind of we're moving forward, but we're retreating. And he gives 3 examples where human beings are kind of challenged in a certain aspect of halacha, and in making what is here presented as the correct or halachic choice, they're almost defeated by God. In the sense here, I don't want to, I think we talked before, like mountains dropping, obligation, but the sense of kind of recoil and recognizing your limits. So he gives 3 examples over here. The first one he gives is kind of in the physical realm. The second one he talks about is emotional, and the third one is intellectual. And I'll give kind of a few examples. So in the physical one, he gives an example of a couple that are young, that are in love, that are finally married, right, and can finally be physical with one another. And before they're about to do this, they realize that the bride is in nida, right? She's gotten her period, right, and they're forbidden to each other. So what happens? And it talks about here that no one's going to know, right? This was like a private encounter. They could have just continued to, to consummate their relationship, even if it was forbidden, right? And no one would have known in that moment. But what do? they retreat, right? And I'll just read the underlined part over here. On page 5, the heroic act did not take place in the presence of jubilating crowds or when they pull back and allow themselves almost to be defeated, right? To limit themselves because of halakha in this moment. No bards will sing of these two modest, humble young people. It happened in the sheltered privacy of their home in the stillness of the night, right? But in this, situation, in this moment, there was the sense of recoil, right, of being defeated in making that choice. And that's kind of in the physical realm. I didn't bring the other examples, but I'll paraphrase. I'm kind of outside. The next example the Rav talks about is in the emotional realm. And he talks about someone who unfortunately loses a relative right before Yom Tov. So the Shiva period, which usually would take place, is actually cut short or in some situations canceled because of Yom Tov. And the Simcha, the obligation to be happy and to celebrate, Yom Tov, a festival, overrides the aspect of Shiva, even though emotionally, if you would ask the person in that moment, the mourner, obviously the natural thing for them emotionally is to want to mourn. But they're asked by halacha to kind of compress their emotions in that moment. And the third one the Rebbe talks about is in the intellectual realm, where we want to understand, we want to categorize everything. But there are certain mitzvot like chukim, laws that seem to have no reason that we're just not going to be able to understand. But we have to say, almost like Dayenu, like we're not going to get it. We're not going to understand this. We allow ourselves in that realm to kind of pull back and allow ourselves, again, using the Rav's language, to be kind of defeated by God. And in all of these, even though he's using terms like defeated, he's giving these as examples of this is gvura. This is real courage. This is halachic. I think he used the term right. Halachic heroism, right? In that sense. And I think, this idea of, sometimes we retreat, we're quote unquote defeated, but it's not a negative thing. It's a source of strength. So maybe, using kind of this idea, we can reintroduce this value of being someone who's commanded, right? Because then the question is what happens when it comes to these hard, challenging moments, right? That kind of, and there are not easy answers. But then when it's not just about the Nasiv and Ishma, it's not just about, well, this is meaningful for me. It's also about a sense, well, I'm obligated to do this. Like I have a real sense of obligation. What am I going to do in those hard moments and in those challenging moments? Yeah, and I see some comments also, right? Kind of like, right, kind of seeing that juxtaposed to like the American tradition as well, for sure. So that's really our first model over here, the sense of coercion or commandedness or obligation. That's our first model. And I think a lot to break down there, but how that fits into society today, into our own personal experience of Torah, of Yahadut, of balancing it out. The second example, and the second model I want to talk about is marriage. And this is another way that Chazal, that the rabbis really view that moment of the giving of the Torah. And very simply, we'll just see this in source 11, though it's referenced in lots of other places as well. Quoting over here, Psukim from Shir Shirim, right, that talks the analogy of the love affair between God and the Jewish people. And it says, what is, just the underlined part, Biyom Chatuno, the day of his wedding, what is this referring to? Ze Matan Torah. So the day of the wedding is Matan Torah. And it's interesting that some other, later post-game, Rav Shimshon ben Tzadok, who was a student of the Maharam in the 12th century, he wrote a book called the Tashbetz HaKatan. He says that actually all of the customs that we have today, and there's some stretches there, we'll play it out, pertaining to a chatan and a kala at a wedding, actually all originate from something we're trying to pull out of Matan Torah. So I'm curious, I'd love to just throw out if anyone has any. It's almost like Family Feud, right? If you had to think of what are some of the customs you might see today at a Jewish wedding that might link back to trying to replicate something at Matan Torah. I'm curious if anyone has any thoughts. What's stuff that happens at a wedding that could be trying to, mimic here or draw out Matan Torah? So we'll give everyone a moment. You can keep posting in the chat. I'll share some of the more obvious ones and some of the ones that seemed to me personally to be a little bit of a stretch, but I thought were really interesting as well. So some of the ones, the aspect of today when we think about a halachic marriage, there's two stages, right? There's the kiddushin or the erusin, that almost like halachic engagement, and the nisuin, the actual marriage. So seeing that, if we're thinking through that time period, right? Maybe Yetziat Mitzrayim, and we see this in different places that God taking us out of Egypt, that was almost the engagement. And then the marriage is when God gives us the Torah. It's interesting that, Rabbi Aryeh Kaplan, who's also someone who wrote a lot of different books, years ago, writes about this as well, that, at a wedding today, a Jewish wedding, a groom walks down first, and then the bride walks down. So you're saying that, if you look at Matan Torah, God goes before Moshe, right? So that's kind of the bride and the groom there as well. Interesting. Some people have the custom of walking down to the chuppah holding candles. He says that could be like the fire at Har Sinai as well. One that maybe sticks or sounds a little bit more, fits is the ketubah, right? The marriage contract that is signed at the wedding, analogous to the luchot. Even the idea over here of breaking the glass. Rav Soloveitchik actually said that breaking the glass could be a hint back to breaking the luchot, right? So interesting also, kind of seeing all those connections back to the marriage in Har Sinai. And I saw this online. I don't know if it's true or not, so you can ask your if anyone has friends in Chabad, but I saw that there's actually an old Chabad minhag, not sure if it's true, that the way you should greet people on Shavuot is you should say Mazel Tov, because it's symbolic of the wedding between God and the Jewish people, which I thought was cute, but I don't know, we can fact check that if you want, but an interesting way as well of kind of building out this analogy. And in essence, I think this analogy can also make sense, right? If you think about it, you have two entities entering into a relationship with one another and having a ceremony to do it. And that's kind of God and the Jewish people, right, at Matan Torah. And what I want to show you here in source number 12 is actually a midrash that develops this idea, but I think it's fascinating to look at it in contrast to the Gemara we saw before about the mountain being held over their head, right, to kind of crush them. So this is a midrash, Mechilta to Rabbi Yishmael, source number 12. And it talks about kind of the pasuk in Zorim. It says, "Vayomer Hashem miSinai ba," that God is coming from Sinai. So what does that mean? God is coming from Sinai. So the midrash is going to get midrashic about it. And we'll start from the underlined part. So don't read it as God just literally coming from Har Sinai. Ela Hashem miSinai ba lekabel et Yisrael kechatan zeh shehu yotzeh likrat kala. God is coming from Sinai to accept the Jewish people like a groom goes out to greet his bride. Great. Skips a little bit more. It says, it goes now back to that word we saw in the very first source of the shir, Vayit Yatzvu, that they all gathered at the foot of the mountain. So what does that mean? They gathered. Nitzfafu, they were pressed together. And then the Hebrew goes on to say, because they were scared of all of the, thunder and lightning and the fire and everything that was going on. Melamed shenitzlash haharmim kamo. So what does it mean that they stood at the foot of the mountain? Sounds very similar to what we just saw in the other Gemara, that God uprooted the mountain from its place. But here's the switch, and listen carefully. Ve'karvu ve'amdu tachat hahar. And God brought them close to stand under the mountain. Shneimar, as it says in Dvarim, v'tekruvun v'tamdun tachat hahar. Aleya mefarash beKabbalah, and then it creates an analogy to Shir HaShirim, as we said again. It talks about the love affair, right, between God and the Jewish people. Yonati b'chagoi hasela b'seter, my dove that is in the cleft of the rock. And I think this is really fascinating over here, because in this way, you also have the mountain being flipped, but it's not as God threatening because he's going to crush the Jewish people that don't accept the Torah, but it's almost like a chuppah, right? God is kind of holding the mountain over them to kind of like cradle them, to nurture them, right? It's paralleling it to Shir HaShirim. You're protected in the cleft of the rock, right? God's there to kind of nurture you and take care of you. And it's a much more kind of loving frame. I think this is just a really interesting way of it's taking almost the same words, the same text, but seeing it through a completely different lens. It's not about the coercion here. It's about the protection, right? It's much more about a loving relationship. And it's interesting because we know throughout Navi, right, the relationship between God and Jewish people is often seen as a marriage, right? To the extent, and I just brought one example, source 13 in Yirmiyahu, this is actually the theme of Sefer Hosea as well, that when the Jewish people then serve idols, the analogy that's given in Navi is, well, now they're like the wayward wife, they're the adulterous wife, right? Kind of cheating on their husband, right? So like that analogy is seen as marriage, but then it gets used down the line when the Jewish people are almost like cheating on God by worshiping other idols as well. And I want to kind of end this one before we go into our last one with coming back to the Maharal before. And I wasn't sure if I wanted to include the source, but I decided to just so we can like know everything, that we saw with the Maharal source. And it's a little bit out there, and I'm curious what people think, because I know I was very shocked when I read it, the Maharal, who originally had given us the whole take, right, that it's only worthy of Torah for God to, for us to not have free will, for it to be kind of something that we're forced into, because otherwise the whole world would be destroyed. So he actually brings it back a little bit to marriage, but I would say in a pretty disturbing way. So, prepare yourselves. He says the following, and he says that there's kind of a silver lining, sort of, a little bit of an interesting but disturbing conclusion here, for the fact that Matan Torah is forced. And he says that just as Jewish people were forced into the Matan Torah, and I'll just read the Hebrew over here, right? Start here. Midrash Matzati Kevan Shabbat Kadosh Baruch Hu Lieutenant Torah Israel. And the Midrash I found, right, when God comes to give the Torah to Israel, Kafa Aleim Pargi, right, he flipped the mountain over them like a tub. Ad Sheyu Anusim Lekabel Brito Shal Kadosh Baruch Hu. So they were forced then to accept the covenant of God. And Kativ Etzel Ones, and we read by the case of a woman who is forced, right here. I mean, here it's talking about a woman who's forced sexually. In Dvarim, the lo tihe lo isha lo yuchala shalcha kol yama. And Dvarim talks about, right, if someone rapes a woman, right, he's not allowed to ever divorce her. Which do a whole share on that, but at least societally at that time, right, she would have seen as being tainted. And the sense of her not being able to him not being able to divorce her would hopefully make sure she was taken care of in society. Though thank God things have progressed hopefully since then. Ubazeh, go back to the Hebrew, Shehaya Kadosh Baruch Hu Me'anesotam, here too, because God forced them, Nisharula Kadosh Baruch Hu Ad Shelo Yuchala Shaleach Otam Leolam. And therefore, since God forced them, God can never send them away. And he goes on to say, well, obviously, the case in Dvarim is a crime, right? Someone did something wrong, right? This analogy doesn't fit perfectly, right? to say the least over here. But I think it's interesting, first of all, jarring, right, that he uses that, but that he comes back to this model of forced to almost bring back this idea that, the Jewish people can never be rejected. Now, I don't think this is as heartwarming as he may have, maybe been going for over here. But I think this really raises interesting questions of what does this contract at Har Sinai mean? What is this relationship? Can one party leave? What if the Jewish people decide we're done? Torah worked for a while, but thank you, Hashem, but we're done right now. Can we back out? Can we back out of this brit? Is it binding forever? And is that framing of something binding forever that God will never reject us, right? Is that something that is comforting, or is that something that is disturbing, right? And I think it's just interesting to kind of see, this is a little bit more of a jarring text, but I think it raises those questions, right? We have this marriage analogy of God as the protector and everything like that. But what does this mean? For this to be a relationship to which there isn't really an out. So a lot to think about there. And people have more thoughts, please feel free to put into the chat. But again, I think that, we still have this idea, I think the marriage analogy is nice. It talks about, as we said before, two entities that are coming together to establish a relationship and a contract. But there is still kind of like a hole. And this is where I think the third and our final analogy will be helpful, which is that God and Jewish people are not equal parties, right? Hopefully in a marriage, people are coming in as equals, right? And their contract between them is a contract between equals, but that's not humanity and the divine, right? So as much as, the Midrash likes to pick up on, the elements that bring us back to marriage, that's not exactly completely accurate when we think about the difference in status between the two parties. And that's where we get to our third and final approach, which is ancient treaties. And we'll see, hopefully, I think this one might stick the most. And for this is something which I thought was super fascinating, which is that many scholars have actually found a lot of parallels between the text of Matan Torah, the text of the giving of the Torah, and what's called ancient vassal treaties from the ancient Near East. And what are ancient vassal treaties? People who might not be familiar with it. Basically, back in the ancient Near East, when the time period of the Bible, when you had like a smaller leader or a smaller king who was in trouble, aka the vassal, they would look to a much stronger king to basically bail them out or save them. And that stronger king was called the suzerain. And that was like the stronger party. And what they would do is they'd go to the stronger king and say, hey, can you please come and save me? And the stronger king would say, sure. But to do so, we're now going to enter in some sort of partnership or treaty between the lesser or less powerful king and the much more powerful king, the vassal and the suzerain. And there would be a set structure to the contract that they would write and the now obligations the weaker king would have to the stronger king. And it was basically like a boilerplate contract that every single vassal treaty would have within it the same kind of 5 elements. And we actually find a lot of parallels between the structures of these treaties and the Brit or covenant laid out at Sinai. And I really like this model for Matan Torah because I think it solves some of the issues with the marriage analogy, right? That Jewish people and God are not equals, right? But here it's recognizing that you have the stronger party and the weaker party, right? The God and the Jewish people. But it's still taking those values from that marriage analogy of commitment, responsibility to one another, public ceremony, but with two parties whose relationship or whose essence is basically unequal. So what do we find in these ancient vassal treaties? So you'd have, this is source 15, you'd have this prologue talking about their previous relationship, how the suzerain saved them. Then you'd have all the kind of like stipulations that the weaker king, the vassal, has to keep. You had to periodically read it and keep the covenant safe. There were going to be witnesses, and there would be a lot of blessings and cursings should you keep it or should you reject it. So already perhaps you're thinking of kind of parallels. And just to kind of flesh out the parallels, Rabbi Joshua Berman, who's written about this explicitly, and you can, this is just a link over here to one of his articles, and I want to pull out some ideas, that we can see this really seems to be a real parallel for Matan Torah. And he talks, and just I'll read, a few parts just from the underlined parts over here. So the first section over here, it says that, what we have at Sinai is a form of agreement where the parties are unequal, where the lesser side, Israel, is expected to agree to the terms dictated by the stronger side, God. On the other hand, it seems that the stronger side is not tyrannical or cruel, but seeks a genuine relationship with the lesser side, but on his terms. And that there's no real modern counterpart to this, even though we found this very, very prolifically in the ancient Near East. So we're going to skip down to just kind of examples from each of these parts. So the historical prologue, it would always kind of list what are the events that led to the establishment of the treaty and how did the stronger king actually save the weaker king. And if we skip down to, the top of page 8, think about how the Aseret HaDibrot, the 10 Commandments, start. It says, God spoke all the words saying, like, I am the Lord your God who brought you out of Egypt, right? How do you start the treaty? What's the prologue? Like, what's the big thing that the more important king did? He saved us. He took us out of Mitzrayim, right? So that's kind of the prologue that we see here. Then the stipulations, it talks about kind of everything the lesser king, the vassal, has to keep. And it talks about how if the vassal king would go to any other stronger kings and try to establish a relationship, that would be seen as treasonous, right? And if you think about it, what's one of the, the opening volley of the Dibrot, the 10 Commandments, which we'll focus on a little bit more next week. It says that you shall have no other gods, right? You can't have any other gods than God. You're not supposed to turn to anyone else. That would be a violation of this treaty. Something that I thought was super interesting was that in a lot of vassal treaties, it says that the weaker king, the vassal, has to make regular appearances to the suzerain to kind of show up and kind of, reiterate, like, yeah, I'm still part of the treaty. And if you think about it, what do we have in Tanakh? We have the Shalosh Regalim, right? The 3 holidays where you have to go forward, right? Or at least someone from the family, perhaps the men, depending on the year, who's able to leave the farm, at that point, everyone has to be seen by Hashem. That the mitzvah of Aliyat L'Regel is a call, he says over here, Rabbi Berman, a call to the vassal Israel to pay a visit of homage to the sovereign King of Kings. And finally, that this treaty in this section has to be routinely read out kind of in that time period. So what do we have? When do we read the Torah or the Brit publicly? We have Hakel, right? The end of the Shemitah year. We get together and we read it publicly as well. Just a couple of other last points as we wrap this up. It's interesting that the treaty had to be deposited in the vassal king's temple. And it's interesting if we think about it, where were the luchot kept, right? In the Aron, right? It's interesting because our temple is really the temple of the other God. But we keep the, both the luchot that were whole and the luchot that were broken, right, in the ark, right, in the Aron and in the Mishkan or the Mikdash. And finally, there were always witnesses here to the treaty, and they were usually, in the ancient Near East ones, gods of nature. But if we think about the parallel, right, in the, what we're thinking about through Tanakh, It talks about Vehi odeti bachem and dvarim hayom et hashamayim v'et haaretz. God calls on the, metaphorically here, but like the land and the heaven and earth to be a witness that we're accepting this treaty. And finally, this is, I think, the easiest parallel. It would end with blessings and curses if you would accept it or not. And as we know in the Torah, right, we have the brachot and the klalot, right, the blessings and the curses, the tochacha that are always read, both in Vayikra and in Dvarim. What happens if we keep the Torah? What's terrible things that are going to happen if we don't, right? And we see all of it together. And just to read kind of part of the summary over here, that, in Rabbi Berman's words, we can see within this use of the vassal treaty model, the manner in which the Torah introduced Israel, the idea of kingship of God. Moreover, the Torah uses this model to help concretize for Israel what it means to be in relationship with God, using a model that was readily familiar throughout the region at that time. So to recap kind of everything that we saw today, and then I'm happy to pause for questions, we really saw 3 models for revelation for Har Sinai. We saw the model of coercion, the Gemara in Shabbat about the mountain that was flipped over our head and God would drop it and destroy us. And we saw the different approaches, including mainly, focusing on the Maharal, who talks about this idea of, it wouldn't have been worthy of Torah to just be our choice. It had to be obligation, right? It had to be kind of placed upon us. And we spoke a little bit about this idea of being a mitzubah, of someone being commanded, and how that's a challenge for our generation, whether it's balancing the ava and the yira, right? The, the nasa and nishma, that we take it upon it because it's meaningful to us and that's really important and we want to honor that. But that when times get tough, we also want the yira. We also want the commandedness, that we're going to stick with it. And we saw the, the idea beautifully kind of played out by Rav Soloveitchik. There's value sometimes in being commanded and letting ourselves be defeated in that sense. That's also a sense of gevura. That's also a sense of strength. Then we saw the model for marriage, where almost the total inversion of the Gemara we had seen before, where the mountain is uprooted, but now there's an idea that it's almost God's holding it as a chuppah. He's holding it as a canopy. He's cradling the Jewish people, protecting them like a dove in a rock. The pasuk from Shir Shirim, all the different minhagim that come back, connecting Matan Torah to marriage. And we said, to a certain extent, it makes sense, right? The 2 parties, entering into a relationship with a public ceremony. But we said at the same time, there's this, they're not equal. And I think that's why I really like presenting the modern scholarship approach, the third one, of seeing it as a vassal treaty. And I think here we see a model for unequal parties that are forming a relationship, a contract with stipulations and responsibilities, right? That's naming this idea that humanity and divine are not on the same level, right? What does it mean for humanity to enter into a contract with God and for that to be binding? And I think as we enter, Matan Torah season here, and we think about how we are receiving the Torah and what accepting the Torah looks like to us, I really want to invite all of us to consider these 3 models, which speak to us more, or elements of which speak to us more. And maybe at different times of our life, or different times even, of different things that are happening to us, we might, lean a little bit more to, okay, the commandedness is what's pulling me through over here. Or really it's the sense of the love and protection, of God, and that kind of, mutual relationship. Or maybe it's a sense of a treaty. And what does it mean to have obligation and responsibility while naming that we're not equal? And with that, hopefully that can help us have a more intentional Shavuot. And I'll pause for questions in a second. Next week, we're going to do a deeper dive into the Aseret Dibrot, the Aseret HaDibrot, the 10 Commandments, to see what messages we can learn from the structure. And then we're going to pivot and see what all of the things that we've talked about so far with the law and the legal aspect of Matan Torah, what does this look like practically in society as played out by Megillat Ruth. So people should feel free to post other comments, questions, thoughts into the chat. My email is at the top if people want to reach out with any questions as well. And with that, if there's any questions, please feel free to raise your hand or to share, and I'm happy to respond. So as we wait to see if people will post anything, I just want to thank the Drisha Institute again for inviting me to speak. I want to thank Lily Naz for keeping us, on schedule here and making sure everything on the back end is running. We really look forward to hopefully everyone joining us for the rest of the series, and please check out the other courses that are offered at Drisha as well. And thank you so much.
Thank you so much for this incredible kickoff to the Matan Torah season, as I'm now going to be calling it. Um, I'm just going to post a link to the Drisha classes that are happening every morning, afternoon, evening, Sunday to Thursday here at Drisha. Um, have We will be continuing our Mission in Depth series. We'll be continuing this fantastic series, and a lot of very exciting classes in there, such as Law and Practice in Early Judaism, with Dr. Malka Simkovich, and of course our weekly Parsha discussion with a different teacher each time. You can find all of those and sign up on that link. I think I'm not seeing any questions, so I think with that we'll just say see you all this time next week for a continuation of this class. Thank you everyone so much.
Thank you, everyone. Have a good night.